Welcome to another episode of I Am Change podcast. I'm really excited today because today we're discussing a very important topic on the socio-economic scene of Nigeria. This is a topic that has raised a lot of dust. A lot of people don't have the understanding of it, or maybe some people have a skewed understanding of it. But I'm glad that we're going to be able to understand so much more about it today because we'll be speaking to an expert on this particular topic. But let me give a little bit of an overview. So in 2024, precisely October 3rd, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu sent tax reform bills to Nigeria's National Assembly. The bills included the Nigerian Tax Bill, Nigerian Tax Administration Bill, the Joint Revenue Board Bill, and the Nigeria Revenue Service Bill. This initiative was actually aimed at modernizing and optimizing Nigeria's tax system. They had key objectives, about 4 of them, which was, most importantly, harmonize revenue administration. They also wanted to be able to get transparency and accountability with this bill. Also introduce digital innovations to simplify the tax system and close loopholes in the Nigerian tax system. And also ensure that there is fairness and protecting vulnerable taxpayers and creating an environment that is conducive for economic growth. The proposed tax bills include 4 key bills, like I earlier said. The Nigerian Tax Bill was a comprehensive piece of legislation that consolidated various tax laws into a single simplified law. There was also the Nigerian Tax Administration Bill that focused mainly on modernizing the tax administration process. Then there was the Nigeria Revenue Service Establishment Bill that wanted to establish a new revenue service to replace the Federal Inland Revenue Service that we currently have. And then the Joint Revenue Board, which was aimed to harmonize the revenue administration across different government levels. This particular bill, the expected impact from it was economic growth, increased revenue, and most importantly, to simplify the process of tax calculations and collections. And there were quite a number of criticisms. There were people who criticized the bill for the fact that it was going to be a disproportionate tax burden. There was also the fact that some people felt like it was going to impact on trade zones and regional disparities and so many other things that came up as a result of the criticism for this bill. And for us to be able to understand this from a layman perspective, which is what the I Am Change podcast aims to do, we went and sat high and low and brought in Akin Oyebode, who is currently the Commissioner for Finance and Economic Development of Ekiti State and the Chairman Forum of State Commissioners of Finance in Nigeria. He's well known in Nigeria's financial and economic landscape, particularly for his expertise in tax reforms and economic policy. As the Commissioner of State in Ekiti State, he's been instrumental in advocating for revenue optimization at the subnational level, emphasizing the importance of fiscal stability of Nigeria's economic growth. He's been a vocal proponent of overhauling Nigeria's outdated tax laws, and he has highlighted the need for us to have comprehensive engagement with stakeholders, including governors, commissioners, and the Joint Tax Board. In addition to his work on tax reform, Mr. Akintunde Oyebode has contributed to shaping Nigeria's fiscal policies through data-driven decision-making and robust stakeholder engagement. He's also been involved in discussions about VAT revenue distribution, advocating for a balanced approach that minimizes disruption while ensuring equitable resource allocation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Akintunde. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Yes, sir. And I'm not going to be doing this alone. I have a co-host for this particular episode. Hafsatu Shinkafi is on as well. So we're going to be moderating this particular podcast together. I'm really excited because this is a topic that it has raised a lot of dust. So I'm happy that we have an expert that can help us break it down. So my very first question for you, sir, would be, I know I raised some objectives, but those were just summarized points from a layman's perspective. But can you just give us the main objectives of what the Nigerian Tax Reform Act hopes to achieve and how does it improve the current Nigerian tax system?
So thank you. I think primarily the main objective of these bills will be to modernize our tax system, right? So you have to start from where we are. We have a tax system that's in some instances a century old. So there's no way you want to improve tax penetration, fiscal efficiency, if your laws are 7-8 decades outdated. So you can see why Nigeria's tax to GDP ratio is where it is, because it doesn't reflect the current realities of the global economy, not to even talk about local nuances. So there are a number of things that these laws aim to achieve. One is consolidating all our revenue collection in what is called the Nigerian Revenue Service. So it's seeking to move from what is a federal inland revenue service to a Nigerian revenue service, which encompasses all revenue collection activities on behalf of the Federation. And it also reflects the fact that NRS is an entity that belongs to the Federation, that works for the Federation, that is accountable to the Federation, not just the federal government. So on one hand, it's giving the Federation more involvement in revenue optimization, but is also harmonizing different collection entities into one. So I'll give you an easy example. The Nigerian Customs Service. If I ask you, what is the Nigerian Customs Service? You'll say it's a revenue generation agency, right? That's what the layman thinks. But that's not the job of customs anywhere in the world. The job of customs, first and foremost, is trade facilitation. The work of customs is to ensure a smooth movement or the smooth movement of goods and services within the ambit of the law. So their role is really to say, let's check smuggling, let's ensure what comes in is legitimate and legally allowed, and let's ensure that we can turn trade around in the quickest possible manner. But today in Nigeria, when the customs service is highlighting its effectiveness, it will start with, we collected X amount. We exceeded our target by 20%. But really, that's not what you're there for. What you're there for is to say, we prevented this amount of contraband from coming in, right? We optimized trade because the turnaround time on imports is now 5 days as against 7. Export volume has grown 25% because we've done X and Y, and we're actually facilitating trade. The person who's collecting the revenue should be the revenue service. So your job as customs is to bill. Let someone else collect the revenue. And why are you interested in collecting the revenue anyway? Unless there's something else in it. So the goal here also separates the functions, right? It ensures that the guy who's doing the technical work is doing the technical work. The person who's collecting the revenue for the Nigerian Revenue Service is collecting the revenue. And it also allows us to then see a true picture of businesses or individuals. So for example, if one entity is collecting all revenue data, it means that if Hafsatu buys a 100 million naira car, right, or imports a car worth 300 million today, and she's paying income taxes of 5,000, one entity can say, but hey, madam, this car, this Lexus X600 or F600 that costs 300 million has an import duty of X against your name. You know, how are you able to afford a car of 300 million if you are supposedly earning 100,000 naira per month, because this is how much personal income tax you're paying? So it gives us a lot more intelligence, right? Business intelligence around taxation. And the more information you know about a taxpayer, the better you are in assessing that taxpayer, you know, and it reduces the subjectivity of best of judgment estimates, which again creates a lot of rancor between taxpayer and tax authorities. So in my opinion, this is a long overdue harmonization of revenue collection capabilities. And it also removes the need to pay different, cost of collection to different entities. And today somebody is getting 7%, another one is getting 4%. If we harmonize all of this in one entity, then we will now go back subsequently to say, guys, now we want to see the benefit of this effectiveness, right? The cost of collection has to come down. If you are one entity collecting multiple revenue lines for the government, then we'll say, well, part of the economies of scale or the benefits of harmonization should then be that the absolute amount that the Federation pays for this activity starts to drop. So I think for me, the central theme here is the harmonization of tax collection. Other things we have in there, for example, if you think about the National Single Window Program, I think for me, it's probably going to be the biggest trade facilitation program we've undertaken in the country. And that's often a missing part of what is embedded in this NRS law. And by making the revenue body front and center of it, it means they can bring everybody else into the room and ensure that for once, we have a straight-through process to help us facilitate imports and exports. The guys implementing our single window initiative are the same guys who implemented the single window initiative in Kenya. And you have an efficient processing platform. I think that's somewhere that Nigeria can learn, right? So we're not going to bring something that has worked in China or Thailand or Singapore, but also something that's worked on the continent, right? Because we all have these claims, we all have these issues. I work for a government. It takes me weeks to import something for the government, not for myself. So imagine if a state government is struggling with clearing its goods at the ports. How much more a business or an individual, right? These are systemic issues we've dealt with for decades, and we need to have the boldness and courage to deal with those. But I think if you think about the other bills, some of these things are looking to help optimize how the states and the Joint Tax Board work efficiently, right? So, and again, I think that for me is a big thing where the federal government and subnationals must work together. We can't work at cross purposes because we are all part of a federation. And that's why I said to the tax authorities that, look, you could have engaged better, because if you think about us as partners, then we won't be having these kinds of debates, the kind of public debates that we ended up having. So I think on one hand, the National Revenue Service Bill is for me the most important of them. And these are all important pieces of legislation and they're consolidated. That's the thing I think I like, that look, we're doing a tax administration bill that revises the tax code. Look, let me tell you, for example, things like remote employment. Nigeria has been so disadvantaged because basically you are saying to someone, if you hire somebody in Nigeria, you have to pay taxes in Nigeria. Now, there's nowhere in the world where an employer who's outsourcing work is going to now say, oh, I have significant interest in Nigeria, I'll pay taxes in Nigeria. They'll just go to a jurisdiction that minimizes their tax obligation. And that's why they'll go to Vietnam, they'll go to India, they'll go to all these places. But as these markets start to become middle income markets, as income levels start to rise in those markets, Nigeria has to be a viable option for these jobs. Because again, we have tens of millions of young people that we want to put into jobs. Our economy doesn't have the absorptive capacity to hire 40 million people today. That is the reality. So while we work on industrializing our country, we also have to take jobs that would have gone elsewhere. And so this kind of adjustments in the tax administration bill starts to make Nigeria a lot more competitive within the global employment landscape, right? And for me, those are the issues that we should be interrogating. That for me is what is more important than the simplicity of VAT distribution, etc., which we seem to have focused on. Now, I do recognize that some of the elements there are inelegant. I have also advocated that things like the determination of VAT, whether the rates or the sharing formula, should not be in a tax bill, right? It should not be in an act of parliament. Those should be things that can be determined by a finance act. What should be there is something that guides the process to say, well, the VAT distribution can be reviewed, say, every 5 years. And the indices determined by XYZ process issued by a gazetted finance bill. Now, imagine if that had happened, the bills today would have been passed because we've now held transformative bills on the back of maybe 5 or 10, sections. The bills cumulatively have 145, if I'm not mistaken, sections. The sections that are up for debate are less than 10. I mean, those are not fundamental issues. Those are technical administrative issues that should not have been part of a bill. They should have been part of a framework or guidelines or a finance act. And so we've now just majored in the minors and allowed the bill stall because of a few areas. So that's my opening comment on the bills, that they are long overdue. As I've often said, I think generally well-intentioned and benefits the federation, both us and the federal government as subnationals.
I love that you broke it down. I think for me, for the very first time, I kind of really saw the objectives and you use practical examples of, multiple taxation, how it affects individuals, instead of just assuming what somebody should pay as tax. This particular bill is going to be able to measure almost accurately what should be expected from somebody. And I think that one of the things that a lot of, people who are not really versed in the economic and financial space in Nigeria struggle with is, how is this going to really address the economic challenges that we are facing in Nigeria? The inflation, how does he address that? I think that's what most people are concerned about. Because a lot of people on the streets, they might not really understand these other things that we've spoken about, but they can relate to, is this going to really bring about a significant change, positive change in the economic realities of Nigeria?
Absolutely. Look, for example, if you think about VAT administration, if you think about things that are exempted or zero rated based on the position of this bill, most of the things that affect common Nigerians are going to carry zero VAT charge. So whether it's food, whether it's transportation costs, whether it's cost of medicines, etc., education, by amending what is allowable within the VAT Act. These bills, especially the Nigerian tax bill, has actually identified and said, look, if you think about the consumption baskets, most of the items that affect the poorest Nigerians will be exempted from VAT. Now, once you do that exemption, what you are doing is you are effectively reducing the cost to the end user. And today, VAT is treated as a sales tax. But if you were to treat it as VAT and you are able to apportion more of it to the derivation principle, what you are going to get is that states will stop charging multiple consumption taxes, which again increases the cost of doing business. And that cost, as you know, tax is always going to be, as best as possible, the producer or supplier or seller is always going to try to pass the incidence of tax to the consumer. So what is just happening is that, yes, governments will make a bit more revenues, but ultimately you and I are going to pay for that. So by actually saying, look, we're reviewing what is VAT exempt, it then means that we are taking the most important elements of consumption away from VAT charges. And that is going to be a saving that is passed on to the consumer. And that also reflects, the government's understanding that we cannot allow consumers carry a large chunk of this thing. Already, agricultural products are VAT exempt anyway. It helps the common man because it makes it easier to determine what companies will pay. It reduces the need for states on their own start to charge or impose consumption taxes, which again increases the cost of doing business. For me, I think the real beneficiary of this is the average Nigerian. And in part of the conversations we've had, we as states have encouraged, the tax authorities to leave, the current VAT tariff unchanged, reflecting our concerns around cost of living, etc., which ultimately means that there might even be a short-term drop in the VAT that is earned by the Federation. But we think that this is a necessary price to pay to keep prices relatively stable. And I'm happy that even before the bills have been passed into law, we're also seeing a number of other things that the government has been doing, starting to affect the direction of travel of consumer prices.
Thank you very much. And I love that, like you said, major things that Nigerians consume will be exempted from the VAT, because that shows that this tax is not just thinking about the people at the top, but also the people at the grassroots who kind of do day-to-day things. Because sometimes a lot of things that Nigerians could afford before, in the new economy, you can't really afford that because of what the VAT is saying. Because, and like you said, businesses would always want to pass that cost onto the consumer. So it's good that if government exempts that, then they're not able to do that, and they in turn make more money, and Nigerians are able also to afford things more easily.
Let me also add this, Rafia, before you ask me a further question.
Okay.
There's the exemption threshold for personal income tax has also gone up.
That was my next question. So maybe I should just let you go ahead and talk, because I was going to say, how does this also affect the personal income tax? So just go ahead.
Okay, so if you think about the proposals, and we'll land at a number, I think it's 800,000 now, which means that the poorest Nigerians won't pay personal income tax. I think there's also an increase in what is an allowable deduction and rent relief. And so we've raised the rent relief bar. We've increased what people can be allowed to deduct. So for example, if you find someone who earns, let's say, 1 million, you'll find that they can actually use 200K of that as rent relief. And their original 800,000 tax deductible amount means that they effectively pay zero taxes, as long as they're able to prove that they qualify for rent relief. Now, of course, if they own their own homes, then of course they don't qualify for rent relief. But that's an easy explanation that we are actually helping the poorest people pay less taxes, or even pay zero taxes at all. There are a lot of exemptions that the tax bills have proposed. Even things around compensation, right? If you earn compensation for something, it's now not taxable. Normally you pay capital gains tax. So let's say you took someone to court for publishing your phone number, and you were compensated to the tune of 10 million. Already when they pay you, the capital gains tax would have been deducted. I think that threshold has been raised to about 50 million, that you only pay anything above, I think, 50 million. Before now, that was 10 million. These are allowable deductions that have been raised, thresholds that have been raised. to ensure that the most vulnerable people are actually not paying more taxes. Look, my personal view, and this is obviously no official view, this is me as a person, is that if we focus on the wealthiest Nigerians and we got the wealthiest Nigerians to pay more taxes, it's a lot more productive than hounding people who earn very little, and asking them to pay more. The reality of the conversation is that in most places, wealthier people have access to more advisory resources and end up paying, an inequitable share of their revenues as taxes, right? So that's where we should fix, in my opinion, the challenges, not by taxing, poorer people who we should help with some social benefits to improve their quality of life.
So that makes a lot of sense, because it's one of the reasons why we also have to deal with a lot of tax evasion in Nigeria, because you're going after people who on a normal, they don't even have the money that you're trying to tax them for, which are the vulnerable Nigerians. But when you shift that to the people who actually have the means and the will to pay, we are able to, easily retrieve this tax. So I'm beginning to understand a lot more about this. I'm just going to go ahead to have Sati now. I think she has a question for you.
Yeah, just to add on what you said, Rafi, like we see in other developing countries and developed countries, taxpayers' revenue is used to uplift the lower income and vulnerable citizens of the country. So in Nigeria, I don't think that's the case. So if this tax reform going to assist in moving the country in that direction, then obviously I think it will be for the benefit of the most vulnerable citizens. And for me, I think for personal reasons, due to where my region and also as an entrepreneur, I would like to ask Mr. Akin about the regional disparities and also increased tax burden on businesses aspect of this bill. There was a lot of political discussions and debates surrounding this bill. As usual, Nigeria, a lot of things seems to be politicized. Unfortunately, sometimes it's for the good and most times not for the good. There were heated debates in terms of regional disparities of the bill and how it's going to benefit one region and how the other region is going to be suffering. Actually, it was really scary in the way that some people expressed the issues surrounding the bill concerning some regions. And also as an entrepreneur, I want to know what burden it is going to increase on businesses like mine, like small, medium enterprises.
Okay, I think the second one is a much easier conversation. If you think about the threshold for CIT, threshold has been raised. So effectively, small businesses, they just have to register. They are potentially paying no taxes. Just ensure you register, you're captured. But a business turning over 10 million will not pay any company income tax. I think for companies, if you add that with Tax Pro Max, which is a digital tool with which FIRS engages with taxpayers, one is that anyone who's got obviously some fairly basic digital skills can register themselves, and they will not be subjected to even any CIT, provided they are within the turnover threshold. I think the elephant in the room is the low trust environment we are in Nigeria. Like I said earlier, we major in the minor. The conversation around VAT allocation, and the distribution mechanism for VAT, if the engagement was better done, would not have led to the kind of uproar that we got. Nothing was designed, in my opinion, to benefit a certain region or to put a certain region at a disadvantage. The conversation was very simple. It was basically a conversation of when you distribute VAT, should the area where the VAT is earned get more from what they contribute to the pot? Now, there are two conversations to have. One is, how do you determine the origin of what should be paid? And I'll use an example. Today, every bank pays a VAT per transaction. When you transfer money, you get charged a money transfer fee. That fee has a VAT component of it, which is remitted to FIRS. Now, because every bank is headquartered in Lagos, regardless of where you are or where you are transacting from, all of that VAT gets attributed to Lagos. If you are MTN, Nigerian breweries, any company that's headquartered in Lagos, all of the VAT that is remitted by that company gets attributed to Lagos, regardless of the fact that the alcohol is consumed in Southeast, in Abia, or let's say in Inewi or Ado Ekiti or wherever. it's attributed to the HQ. Similar for the oil companies, which is why you find that Lagos and Rivers tend to have a much larger share of the VAT contribution today, right? That is not to say significant economic activities don't happen in those two cities, but if you were to attribute correctly to the location of consumption, because that's where value-added tax should be attributable to, you will find that the derivation sharing will differ. We don't know by how much, because today it's not an exact science. Today it's still an academic discussion, but it will differ. So that's step one. What the proposal is aiming to do is to disaggregate that, is to say this should go to where consumption happens. Now, the first debate is, can you do this today as FIRS? Prove to us that you can genuinely, attribute consumption to the right places. The Fiscal Reform and Tax Committee claim they can do this. But obviously, there are people who don't trust that they can, and they keep asking for more assurances or proper data to show that they can. So that's step one of the conflict, that can you attribute correctly where consumption happens? Now, having gone past that, let's assume we go past that. Step two is then what percentage, because remember, this is distributed on the basis of derivation, right? Equality and population. Now, we're moving from what was a 20, 30, 50 to what is being proposed to be a 60, 20, 20. So today, derivation is 20%, population is 30%, equality is 50%, which means 50% of what is in the pot today is shared on the basis of equality. Everybody gets the same thing out of that 50%. Now, of what is left, 20% is then shared in the percentage of what you contribute, and 30% is shared based on your population distribution as a share of the total, right? So, of course, when you move what is a 20, 30, 50 sharing formula to now 60 going to derivation, where people are already worried that you can't attribute properly what is derived from their location, there will be a cause for concern. That's the underlying issue. Now, forget all the propaganda, right? This is a political environment, so there will be lots of propaganda, but that's the fundamental issue, right? Which is why I said, again, naysayers and troublesome people will then go and amplify this and start to misinform the public. But let me tell you a funny story. Today, Ekiti State, where I'm from, in the Southwest, is probably the third largest contributor to VAT. And I'll tell you why we pay more VAT than many states. Why? Because every time we issue a contract, we make our full tax deductions from those contracts and we remit them to FIRS. But you know what that does to us? It means that our cost of contracting is higher than some other states. Because some other states will either not deduct those taxes or they will deduct them and not remit them. If you don't increase the derivation components, where is the punishment for those states? So those states have more population than us, and then they already share 50% equally. So you have somebody who is contributing 1% to the pot, earning 15% of the pot. Whereas I am contributing, let's say, for argument's sake, 5% to the pot, and I'm only getting 3% out. So actually, the current structure incentivizes me to be a bad actor. Do you understand me now? The current structure incentivizes me to be a bad actor as a state because it doesn't really mean much. I'll earn more if I keep the VAT to myself, I don't remit it to the pots, and I wait for the general thing to be distributed. Look, we need to reform this country. And we as Nigerians must determine whether we want to reform the country or want to pay lip service to it. There's value in increasing the share of derivation. My own personal perspective is that let's not move from 20 to 60. It's a steep shift. And what we eventually recommended is let's move that from 20 to 30 today. But we must say maybe we should re-evaluate this every 3 years. So that in 3 years' time, all the states know that this 30 is likely going to move to 40 or 50. And so they better get prepared to contribute more to the pots. It's also a way of encouraging people to be more competitive, to attract more businesses, to ensure their economy grows, and to win ourselves off the notion of just sharing centrally collected revenues. I am a big fan of fiscal federalism. I think that it's a journey. As I always like to say in these kinds of conversations, nation building is an unending exercise. we will contribute our bits to it. Other people will come and build from where we've left. So we might not be perfect, but we must at least show that the direction of travel is that we're traveling in the right direction, and that we are improving the state of our fiscal federalism. And I think that's what that VAT component seeks to do. So when you strip out the politics, nobody ever explains it clearly. This is the real issue. Of course, the tax authorities have a responsibility to show us that they can actively and correctively define, the place of consumption. Right? So I'll give you an example. If I open my account in Lagos, which is where I open my bank account, but I live in Ekiti, right? How do you determine where my transactions happen? Of course, if I'm using internet banking, maybe, you can use like my telco data, etc., to figure out where I'm transacting from, all of that stuff. But the reality is that there's a lot of technical work. The easier ones to do are things like telephone calls, SMS, that one, you just triangulate, you use, the point of presence where the call is being originated, or where the browsing session is being originated, and you share the revenues based on that. For fast-moving consumer goods, you can I'm sure the bureaus can tell you where the end product is being sold, and, do the allocation based on that. But for some other sectors, it's not as easy. And because VAT is a value-added tax, you can't decentralize the collection. Because if I take your headphones, Rafiat, for example, maybe the leather, that comfortable leather in there came from Kano State. Maybe the thing was coupled in Ogun State. Maybe it's ultimately being sold in Lagos. At every point of that production process, somebody adds value. They can only charge VAT on what they've added value on, not the full cost of the product, right? So maybe it costs 100,000 naira to make these headphones. But when it was sold to you, it was sold to you for 150. So Lagos will own only 50,000 of that 150 is attributable to Lagos. The other 100 is attributable to the other places where value has been added. Now, if you say states collect, Lagos is going to say, I don't know about what happened in the other 100,000. All I see is a 150,000 naira product here, and I want to collect full value on it. So what will then happen is that it becomes a sales tax, not a value-added tax. And the implied value-added tax will now be, say, 50 or maybe even 100%. So that's why you need a national body who can see the transaction from one end to the other to collect and allocate based on where the value is being added and the tax is being charged. My view is that, look, this is a well-intentioned conversation, but if we're going to improve the federation, we mustn't view these things through, the tinted and sometimes narrow lens or lenses of tribalism, states, jurisdiction. At the end of the day, for this country to grow, we're going to have to trust ourselves. We can't continue to operate as a low-trust environment. We've got to ask ourselves, regardless of whose ox is God, what is the right thing to do? And for me, those are the things that, in my opinion, just tells me that our federation is not yet mature. So it's not surprising, because when you think about the federation in terms of maturity, this is a sub-100-year federation. We're still getting to know ourselves. This is a 2-generation federation for all intents and purposes, right? So we don't know ourselves that well, and in that period, we fought a very nasty civil war, which again created, massive fault lines. So I always say that, my generation is the first real generation that didn't see a war. Those of us born in the 70s. So if you think about that, we have a unique opportunity to detach ourselves from a generation that sees things through the lenses of people who have fought a nasty civil war. We might have heard stories, etc., but we didn't see it. So it gives us a chance to reset. As more of us from the 70s downwards get into public service, get into policy-making roles, we must try to remove ourselves from the narrow confines of tribalism and of identity. Everybody identifies as something, right? We are going to identify either gender, religion, tribe, etc. But the way society builds itself is that equity and justice must be the foundation of the society. And that, for me, is where we have to get to. And things like fiscal federalism help us get there. So these are needed debates. We shouldn't shy away from the debates. And that's why I, as an individual, was an active participant in those debates, because I felt that those are debates that we need to have as a country. And they might be politically incorrect answers in some instances, but we need some political incorrectness to also move this nation forward.
Yes. Totally agree with you there. Totally agree with you. Although, as you've mentioned, there's some aspects of it that require sensitivity to certain places, like you've rightly mentioned. And even there are better questions to ask than those identity and low tribal questions to ask. And like you said, it's a political environment, so we expect it. And also how Nigerian affairs go, it just comes with the territory. I'm so glad that you also mentioned the issue of leadership, even, stepping aside from the subject and the topic that we're discussing today, to go into leadership and what we need to strive for. And also talking about generations, you are part of the generation and you're in the public service. So we just need that outlook. Coming back to the topic at hand, I remember at the time it was so heated, and it took the focus away from the issue. And it was even becoming scary at some point, because at first, before I got to understand more, I was really just thinking that, we're going to be in hot soup, like we're done, in terms of like my own states. My states are one of the poorest, unfortunately. And, I just thought that, okay, it has to be looked at from a humanitarian angle and forget about policy. This is, we have to look at it from a humanitarian angle and not put these people out in the dust, or so to speak. But anyways, now there's more clarity on it. And do you know anything about the reforms that were proposed by a certain governors forum or some kind of body? Please, can you say one or two things about those reforms?
Ultimately, these were conversations and engagements. At some points, obviously, the Presidential Tax Reform and Fiscal Committee came to engage with the Nigerian Governors Forum, who also invited commissioners of finance and the Attorney General, chairman of the Internal Revenue Services in the respective states, to participate in the discourse. Of course, at the end of that conversation, the NGF issued a communique making recommendations, but ultimately, those recommendations were both to the committee and to the National Assembly. Because at the heart of this matter, these are acts of parliament. So the final pen is held by two sets of people, the legislators and the presidents. Of course, the legislators are expected to ensure that the laws reflect the views and aspirations of their people. And so I said then, and I keep saying that, the comments by people like Senator Ali Ndume, for example, reflects the fears and concerns of his people, and he's well within his rights to share those sentiments, right? It's a democracy. People must have the space, to share their concerns, because that's why they've been elected. But it's also important that where we are now well educated, we also go back to our communities and we educate our people to say, this is why we've now supported these reforms. That's also part of legislative activity. And that's one part that is often underutilized.
Yeah.
Legislators should go back home to say, come, this is what I voted yes. This is how it's beneficial to you. This is why it's important to the country, because those things help people better understand these reforms. For example, not to call anybody out, but I'm not sure that any legislator in Nigeria went back to their constituency to organize a town hall.
No, I didn't see that.
I don't have it on record. All the town halls that I hear about are in Abuja, which is home to less than 1% of the country. And that's about the maturity of our democracy. If this was happening, for example, in the US, you see people go back home to say, this is what has been brought. We know you have concerns. Share your concerns. Let's discuss. And at the end of the day, that person then comes back with a submission to the legislature saying that this is the concern from my constituency, signed by constituents, to show that you've actually engaged your constituency. If you take, for example, where I'm from, Ekiti North, there's nothing saying, go around the north. It's all of maybe 57 wards. And at the end of the day, 57 ward representatives sign a resolution saying that this is the position of my senatorial constituency. Or even in the House of Reps, Kolere North Constituency 1, say, look, 24 wards. These are the resolutions of my constituents on this matter, right? Because it enriches the conversation. That's something that we also must do. But again, this is part of development. There will be more opportunities, again, for more engagements. And one hopes that as we evolve and improve, the legislators also go back to their constituents and get them involved in the process. Because I think that's a very big part of civic engagement and of nation building.
Absolutely. And I think that's why sometimes we have a lot of uproar and a lot of misinformation in the public space because people don't understand it. And there's actually nobody out there that they can trust that's in government that is looking out for their own concerns. And I really love what you said about having town hall meetings and explaining the nitty-gritty to these people to say this and this and this is what this particular bill is about. This is how it affects you. And you have your own say as well. And I love that Hafsatu raised that particular conversation because it was one of the loudest criticism and it kind of overshadowed almost everything that the bill was about. And except you were willing to step out of that space to educate yourself beyond that, it felt like the only thing that was the main concern of the tax reform bill. And thank you so much for breaking it down very intelligently, Mr. Akintunde Oyebode. I think my final question, except maybe Hafsatu has another one, is you've broken it down. We've seen some of the drawbacks of this bill. We've had a lot of public debate on it. It's still going on. A lot of discourse is still going on. Like you said, two people hold the pen, the legislators and the president. But looking at this, the way the conversation has gone about the new tax reform, what do you think the timeline is going to look like for implementing this? And what can, the Nigerian citizens expect as regards this particular bill in the coming months?
I mean, I think the conversation is coming to a close. As we followed in the media, the public hearings have now been held because the public hearing is the last part of the committee's work. And the two committees, both the House of Reps and Senate, should now send the final versions of the bills to their respective houses for passage. Of course, what will happen, I think, in terms of sequence, is that the two legislative houses will always have an alignment committee where they then align the versions. Each of them would have concluded on a version, and they will then have an alignment committee to agree the final version that will be transmitted to Mr. President for signing. I think, honestly, no later than April, this process should come to a close, including the assent by Mr. President, if the versions of the four bills that are passed to him are deemed acceptable by the executive. I don't expect that after the kind of dialogue that has happened, that there should be a need for the president to return, the bills to the National Assembly. I think we've had sufficient time, to ensure that there's alignment with the final version. I have been very clear about certain things. For example, even as I speak, you might think I'm a wholehearted endorser of all the sections. But I've said, for example, that certain sections of the tax admin bill that allows the National Revenue Service to deduct monies for tax refunds without recourse to the Federation Account Allocation Committee has been against the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. I've said publicly that it's very clear. Section 162 is clear. All monies that stand to the credit of the Federation accounts can only be distributed, upon a FAC resolution. And so any monies that FIRS, as it currently stands, or NRS, as it will be known soon, must first come into the Federation account and can only be deducted when the committee approves such can happen. So, those kind of provisions, for example, need to be expunged. But again, of 145, it's impossible to expect that 145 will be correct. So there must be a margin and an allowance for some error. But this is the process of correcting such errors. And I'm sure that the final laws will reflect the aspirations of most, if not all, Nigerians.
Thank you so much. It has been amazing and fantastic just listening to you break down this thing in a way that is devoid of all of the hula value that comes with it. And most importantly, stripping it down to the things that matter, stripping it down to why some of these criticisms were so loud, what the bill aims to achieve, how Nigerians can benefit from this bill, what individuals can look forward to, what small businesses can look forward to. And most importantly, also being very vocal about your criticisms about the tax reform, and also how government can better engage when it comes to introducing these kind of policies to the Nigerian citizens next time. I truly appreciate your time. I truly appreciate you being here. And it's been a pleasure speaking to you and listening to you on this particular topic. Hafsatu, do you have any other questions for Mr. Akin today?
Mr. Akin, I'm so happy that you joined us and, you've clarified all my questions about this bill. And I'm sure many other people too would have a lot of clarity from your submissions. And, thank you so much. Nice to see you again. I hope I'll see you in person soon. And yeah, well done. Well done on everything. Take care.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you for this platform. It's important that we have platforms like this that help educate people, that allows us to have pretty honest and frank conversations about the direction of travel of our country. So thank you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of I Am Change podcast. We hope you gained valuable insights and understanding from our conversation with Akintunde Oyebode about the new tax reform bills. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review. Would love to hear your thoughts as well, so share them with us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram using the hashtag #IamChangePodcast. My name is Rafiat Akiwande, and from I and my co-host, Hafsat Shinkafi, we say join us next time on I Am Change podcast as we continue to explore more topics that matter and make a difference. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep pushing for positive change everywhere you are.